What happens when Hollywood royalty steps into the world of late-night comedy, only for the conversation to go completely off script? What you're about to see is one of the most uncomfortable moments in modern television. A routine interview turned into a battle of words, and a legendary actress decided she'd had enough. This is the story of how Candice Bergen walked off Stephen Colbert's show, leaving the audience stunned and viewers at home asking the same question. What just happened? It began like any other taping of The Late Show. Stephen Colbert was in his element, the crowd buzzing with energy. Backstage, Candice Bergen prepared for what was supposed to be a simple promotional appearance. Her latest passion project finally ready for the spotlight. The producers gave her the usual reminder. Stephen loves to wander into politics. He might bring up your past comments. Candice nodded. She'd been doing interviews for decades. Nothing rattled her anymore. Or so she thought. The opening monologue rolled by without a hitch. Stephen landed his usual sharp punchlines. The crowd roared with laughter. And then he turned to the night's guest. Ladies and gentlemen, an Emmy-winning actress, a comedy legend, and someone who's never been afraid to speak her mind. Please welcome Candice Bergen. The applause was warm. Candice walked out with grace, smiling, settling into the guest chair. For the first few minutes, it was light banter. Compliments, laughter, talk of her career. But then Stephen leaned in. Your new project tackles some heavy themes, and you've always been outspoken. I'm curious. How do you see Hollywood's role when it comes to speaking out on social issues? The energy shifted. Candice's smile softened into something more thoughtful. You know, Stephen, I think there's a difference between having a platform and feeling pressured to use it in ways that aren't authentic. Somewhere along the line, we started confusing visibility with obligation. Stephen raised his eyebrows. Interesting, but surely you'd agree that silence in the face of injustice is complicity. Candice's response was calm. Deliberate. That's a very black and white way of framing a gray world. And frankly, I'm surprised to hear you reduce it like that. The audience felt the temperature in the room drop. Stephen pressed, his grin tightening. When you have a platform, like yours, like mine, don't you think there's a responsibility to take a stand? There's a responsibility, to be honest, Candice said, leaning forward slightly. And honestly, I think Hollywood has become obsessed with virtue signaling. We've forgotten how to tell stories that actually matter to people's lives. The word hung in the air. Virtue signaling. The audience froze. Stephen's expression hardened. That's quite an accusation. Are you saying people who use their platform to advocate are just performing? Candice didn't blink. I'm saying that when everyone uses the same outrage, the same words, the same script, it stops being authentic. It stops being art. It becomes conformity dressed up as activism. The silence in the studio was deafening. What had started as late-night chatter was now a collision of worldviews. And it was only the beginning. Behind the scenes, Stephen's writers and producers were almost certainly scrambling, whispering into headsets, trying to figure out how to pull the show back to safe ground. But Stephen Colbert wasn't the kind of host who backed down on his own stage. So what you're really saying, he pressed, his tone tighter now, is that people like me, who use humor to address serious issues, are just conformists pretending to care? Candice didn't flinch. I'm saying you're far more compelling when you ask questions than when you hand out answers. The words hit the studio like a crack of thunder. Stephen's face flickered. Confusion, irritation, maybe even hurt. The audience, so used to laughing on cue, sat frozen, unsure whether they were still watching a comedy show or a standoff. That's an interesting way to put it, Stephen replied, his smile visibly strained. But I'd argue asking questions and offering perspective is exactly what good comedy does. I agree, Candice said, pausing. For a moment it seemed like she might soften. Then she added coolly, when it's actually comedy, Stephen's head snapped slightly. I'm sorry, what's that supposed to mean? It means that when you spend more time lecturing than laughing, more time telling your audience what to think than helping them think, you're not doing comedy anymore. You're doing propaganda with a punchline, the audience gasped audibly. Whatever this was, it wasn't late-night banter anymore. Propaganda? Stephen repeated, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. Candice leaned in, calm and unyielding. Yes. If you want to be a political commentator who occasionally tells jokes, own it. But don't pretend you're still a comedian when the show has become a nightly sermon for people who already agree with you. Stephen's hands, once animated, now locked together on his desk. His voice carried an edge. That's rich. Coming from someone who built a career playing Murphy Brown, a character who was basically a megaphone for liberal values. Murphy Brown was fiction, Candice shot back instantly. A scripted character with scripted opinions. The audience knew it was entertainment. There's a difference between telling stories with a point of view and disguising commentary as comedy. So now I'm disguising news as entertainment? Stephen challenged. I'm saying that when the line between journalism and comedy blurs so much, the audience can't tell the difference. We have a problem. And when comedians start believing they're journalists, we have a bigger one. Stephen leaned back, studying her like an opponent instead of a guest. I'm trying to figure out if you actually believe what you're saying, or if you're just here to stir the pot. I'm trying to have an honest conversation, Candice said evenly. Something that's getting harder to find in this business. Honest conversation, Stephen echoed. He leaned forward again, his tone sharper. Let's be honest then. You're basically arguing that people with a platform shouldn't use it to stand up for what they believe. That's not honesty. That's moral neutrality. And moral neutrality, Candice, looks a lot like complicity. Candice's composure cracked just enough for the audience to see the steel underneath. I'm arguing for artistic integrity. I'm arguing against the groupthink that's turned Hollywood into one giant echo chamber, where everyone claps for the same opinions because they're too afraid not to. Groupthink, Stephen said, his irritation undisguised now. Yes, Candice replied firmly. So let me get this straight. Stephen pushed. Everyone who disagrees with you is guilty of groupthink? No, Candice said. But everyone who's afraid to disagree with the prevailing orthodoxy absolutely is. And what orthodoxy would that be? Stephen pressed, leaning in with a hint of mockery. Candice didn't blink. You know exactly what it is. We all do. The unspoken list of acceptable opinions, acceptable targets, acceptable narratives. The understanding that some viewpoints will end your career, while others guarantee you applause. The silence that followed was heavy. This wasn't just uncomfortable television anymore. It was a collision, and everyone in the room knew it was building towards something explosive. Stephen's jaw tightened. Are you seriously suggesting that people in this industry only express progressive views because they're afraid not to? I'm suggesting, Candice replied evenly, that when dissent becomes professionally dangerous, you don't have diversity of thought. You have conformity, enforced by social pressure. And you think I'm enforcing conformity? Stephen pressed. I think, she said, her voice steady but heavier now. You've grown comfortable being applauded for saying things your audience already agrees with. And I think that's made you less curious about perspectives that might actually challenge you. The audience was motionless, caught in the crossfire. What had started as an interview was now something else entirely. Two worldviews colliding in real time. Stephen inhaled slowly. When he spoke again, his tone had that dangerous, deliberate calm. You know what I think is happening here, Candice? I think you're confusing moral clarity with conformity. You're mistaking taking a stand for groupthink. And frankly, you're dressing up avoidance as independence. You don't want the responsibility that comes with silence. Candice's own composure trembled, but her words cut clean. And I think you're confusing self-righteousness with moral clarity. You're mistaking echo chamber applause for impact, and you've forgotten the difference between challenging power and performing for people who already agree with you. The room was electric now, the tension humming in the air. Producers behind the curtain were likely in panic mode, but neither Colbert nor Bergen seemed interested in retreat. Performance, Stephen repeated, his voice low. That's what you think this is? I think, Candice said, and this time her tone carried something close to disappointment. That you've become so invested in being right that you've stopped being curious about being wrong. The words landed like a slap. Stephen froze, his face unreadable. For a moment, the only sound was the quiet hum of the cameras and the shallow breaths of a stunned audience. Curious about being wrong? Stephen echoed, his voice sharp with restraint. That's rich. Coming from someone who spent the last 15 minutes offering nothing but criticism wrapped in superiority. I'm not here to solve your problem. Stephen! Candice replied, steel edging her tone. I came because you invited me to talk about my work. Instead, you've spent this interview asking me to validate yours. My approach, Stephen said, his composure finally cracking, is to use whatever influence I have to speak for people without a voice, to call out injustice, even when it costs me viewers. Your approach, Candice countered, leaning forward, is to perform outrage for an audience that rewards you for it, to punch down at easy targets while convincing yourself you're speaking truth to power. The challenge hung between them, heavy as lead. Punch down? Stephen said slowly, his hands flat on the desk, knuckles white. Who exactly do you think I'm punching down at? Anyone who dares ask uncomfortable questions about the orthodoxies you reinforce. She shot back. Anyone unwilling to perform the purity test this industry now demands. So now I'm enforcing ideological purity? Stephen asked, his voice sharp. You're rewarding it. Candice answered without hesitation. The audience shifted uneasily, unsure if this was still a show or something unraveling before their eyes. You know what, Candice? Stephen said, his voice rising. What's really happening here is that you're angry the world moved on, that audiences don't want the old both sides cleverness that passed for sophistication. They expect principles now. They expect their entertainers to stand for something. Candice sat straighter, her presence suddenly colder, sharper. And I think you've convinced yourself that having the right opinions is the same as having principles. You've mistaken popularity for bravery. Bravery! Stephen repeated, leaning forward, his voice cracked upward. Tell me about bravery, Candice. Tell me who's braver, the host who puts himself on the line every night, or the actress who shows up to lecture from the sidelines? Her reply was quiet, but it carried the force of a hammer. Bravery, Stephen, is risking your comfort to challenge the people who actually hold power. What you do is mock from a perch in Manhattan, safe, profitable, and always aimed at the targets your audience already hates. That was the moment. The air snapped. Everyone in the studio knew something irreversible had just happened. Something shifted in Stephen's expression, a hardening that suggested they'd crossed a line neither of them had intended to cross. My comfortable perch, he said, his voice low and controlled in a way that was somehow more unsettling than if he'd been shouting. You mean this job that I work at every day? Trying to make sense of an increasingly senseless world for people who are scared and confused and looking for some kind of guidance, or at least some relief? You mean this platform that insulates you from the consequences of your rhetoric, while letting you feel morally superior to everyone who doesn't share your certainties? My certainties, Stephen repeated, and now he was moving around the desk toward her chair. The audience was completely silent, some of them glancing toward the exits as if they sensed they shouldn't be witnessing this. My certainty that racism is wrong. My certainty that people deserve health care. My certainty that democracy is worth defending." "Your certainty," Candice replied, her voice steady but with an edge of steel, "that you understand complex issues better than the millions of people who disagree with you. Your certainty that your moral framework is the only valid one. Your certainty that anyone who questions your assumptions must be motivated by ignorance or malice." Stephen stopped moving, now standing just a few feet from her chair. "And what's your framework, Candice? What's your grand philosophy? Sitting on the sidelines critiquing everyone who actually gives a damn? My philosophy," she said evenly, "is that art should complicate rather than simplify, that entertainment should challenge rather than confirm, that intelligence means being humble about how much you don't know, not arrogant about how much you think you do." "Humble," Stephen said, and there was something like a laugh in his voice, but not a pleasant one. "The irony of you lecturing me about humility while sitting there acting like you're the only person in this industry with any intellectual integrity is apparently lost on you." That was when Candice Bergen did something no one in the studio expected. She smiled. Not a friendly smile, not a diplomatic smile, but the kind of smile that suggested she had been waiting for this exact moment. "You know what, Stephen? You're absolutely right. The irony is lost on me, just like the irony is lost on you. You've spent this entire interview proving every point I've made about what's wrong with the way this industry approaches these conversations." She stood up, removing her microphone with practiced ease. "What are you doing?" Stephen asked, his anger suddenly replaced by confusion. "I'm leaving," she said simply, setting the mic on the chair. "Because this conversation was supposed to be about my work. But you couldn't help turning it into a referendum on yours. Because you couldn't hear a critique without making it personal. Because you've proven you're more interested in being right than being thoughtful." The studio was dead silent now. "Candice, wait," Stephen said, his host instincts finally kicking in. "Look, if I've offended you, that wasn't my intention. We're having a discussion. We can disagree and still be civil about it." She paused halfway to the exit and turned back to face him. "Civility isn't the issue here, Stephen. The issue is that you invited me on your show and then spent the entire time trying to get me to agree with you instead of actually listening to what I was saying. The issue is that you can't imagine that someone might disagree with you for reasons other than moral failing or intellectual inadequacy." "That's not true," Stephen protested. "But his voice lacked conviction, isn't it?" she asked. "Then tell me one thing I've said tonight that you've actually considered might be valid." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of everything they'd said and everything they couldn't take back. "That's what I thought," Candice said quietly. "I hope you got something out of this, even if it wasn't what anyone expected." And with that, she walked off the stage, leaving Stephen Colbert standing alone in front of his desk, his audience and his cameras, trying to figure out how a routine interview had become something else entirely. "So, what do you think? Was Candice Bergen out of line for walking off, or did Stephen Colbert push too hard and prove her point about the state of discourse in entertainment?"